So hello everybody, thanks for joining us today. So today we're starting a new set of videos in relation to Christianity in America, and actually there's significant difference in Christianity in America and Christianity as it's practiced in Europe. Just because of historical reasons basically. And it goes right back to the Reformation in 1517. Martin Luther began the Reformation, which was the reform of the Catholic Church, is what he was aiming for. And he wanted to get rid of, clear up the abuses in relation to indulgences. But as he got into a conflict and various arguments with the church over the next few years, he developed basic principles, which is, one is basically faith alone, another is scripture alone. And these theories and the conflicts that emerged between various European states over the following couple of centuries caused a lot of wars, which I actually go into in previous videos if you'd like to subscribe. But as the actual religion, the Christian religion, transferred across to America from the various European countries, from England especially, and also of course from France and Germany, and from Switzerland and Holland, there'll be the five main countries that had a big influence in terms of the beginning of Christianity in America. And of course, the actual idea of scripture alone also travelled with it, very much more so, in an exaggerated form if anything, because in Europe, when the authority of the church was challenged, very often the actual various states took over. Because a place like England, the state took over because it wanted to take over the church land, wanted to get greater level of independence from Rome, etc. And other of course, European states followed a similar trajectory really in relation to, but there was actually a lot of state control, or either control from the centre of Rome, from the papacy, or else control from the various territories, the various countries within Europe. But in America, it was a very different experience. There's little or no control there. And between that and the doctrine of scripture alone was very powerful at that stage as well, by the time the colonies were founded in the 1600s and the 1700s. And also, of course, by that time, the Bible had been reduced in size from a 73 Bible. Well, the Bible hadn't been reduced, but one version of the Bible had been reduced in size from a 73 book Bible back to a 66 book Bible. And that actual reduction in those books actually was, to a certain extent, a considerable loss, in that it put a different emphasis on Christianity in America. And that, combined with scripture alone, led to a lot of division, a lot of various denominations. And of course, Europe has a very different experience to America also, in regard to the fact that Europe suffered a lot of conflicts. In Switzerland, there was the first country there was actually a civil war in, as a result of the Reformation, because the various different territories had military alliances with each other. But once the Reformation occurred, actually that confidence of support from other cantons or provinces within Switzerland was no longer there. And that actually created tensions, created stress, created distrust, and eventually led to a civil war in Switzerland. It's the first civil war it's only a small preview on actually what happened later. But the American experience is very different in that there was never any wars over religion there. So it was mainly a background of revivalism and various different, a very different experience, in the sense that scripture alone is the central doctrine, and revivalism is very much part of the background of American Christianity, rather than wars and conflicts and all that. So it's actually a more energized, different type of Christianity as a result of these two different historical backgrounds. And just to give a brief summary of the actual theological background in terms of what happened in the time of the Reformation. First of all, we had Martin Luther, who started out with a very strong theology of scripture alone. And in the 1520s, he wrote a book called On the Bondage of the Will, which meant that as far as salvation is concerned, mankind has no free will. So salvation is all the work of God, according to Martin Luther. This is different to the actual Catholic theology, and Catholic theology going right back to the apostles. never agreed with the idea that mankind's free will had nothing to do with salvation. But this was Martin Luther's reading of the Bible, and actually a more influential, if anything, more influential theologian than actually Martin Luther would be John Calvin. John Calvin took up the idea of the bondage of the will, and he developed it into theories like predestination, which meant that since mankind has nothing to do with their own salvation, according to this theory, God determines everything, both the elect and the people who are condemned before they're even born. That particular theology travelled in the form of Calvinism across to America, but actually in a country that places a high emphasis on freedom and personal ambition and personal choice, Calvinism actually was very successful, very dominant theology in the first few decades, and especially in the 16 and 1700s. But as America developed and the colonies developed, Calvinism tended to decline, and another branch of Christianity known as Arminianism, which is a more Catholic version of Christianity than Calvinism. It's actually recognizing that human free will has a role in salvation. That emerged as Methodism. It emerged in the revivalist movements of Jonathan Edwards and the various different great preachers and theologians that brought the faith westward to the various different new states, etc. So this is a very interesting development in the sense that faith alone and scripture alone is finding itself in a new experimental ground in terms of America. And there's no state in America prepared to, or no pope, no bishops, initially anyway, for the first couple of centuries there was no bishops. There's nobody to actually dominate or dictate exactly what you believe. So people made up their own mind what they were going to believe. And eventually in that environment, Calvinism, which is based on strictness and based on, Calvin had a particular model of Christianity in a city known as Geneva in Switzerland, and it worked in cooperation with the state to impose various moral laws, a kind of a theocracy, if you like. In one situation, there was one great theologian who was actually burned to death because he actually had a different view of the Trinity to Calvin. So that type of course, there was also laws against drinking. Actually, there was even laws in Geneva against dancing, which is very difficult to imagine at this stage. But that was the situation in Geneva. That worked in the early colonies, but as America expanded and the various different revivalist groups came along, Calvinism tended to go into decline, and that was the experience the first couple of centuries. And then, of course, when the United States was founded itself 250 years ago now, actually in 1776, I think the Declaration by Thomas Jefferson was written in 1776, himself and the other founding fathers. Of course, they recognized a lot of them had some sort of ancestral background in Europe. Some of them had background, especially in England, in Germany, and France. And these people, the founding fathers, all recognized that religious conflict in Europe had created immense suffering, immense pain, tremendous conflict, wars. Millions of people died in these conflicts, and they recognized that it was actually important to keep Christianity, or to keep any religion, out of the hands of the government. And their constitution was written very much with that in mind. And as a result, Calvinism went into further decline because there was no state, there was no institution to support it. So people made up their own mind on the basis of common sense and various different revivals meetings. I watched actually Billy Graham and people like that involved in altar calls where these brilliant preachers actually, you can imagine what Jonathan Edwards was like a couple of centuries before that. These people invite people to come up and accept Christ. That's contrary to Calvinism. Calvinism does not believe in that type of Christianity. And therefore, in that scenario where people were actually invited to make up their own mind, to make their own personal decision, Calvinism and its strict theory of predestination tended to decline in America. So that's one of the features of American Christianity. But there are many other features as well that are very interesting. And I intend to develop those points in future videos. I'll do 3 or 4 videos contrasting the actual European experience with the American experience over the next couple of weeks. If you'd like to subscribe to see that. Thanks very much for joining for today.